Good to go. Okay, and here we go. 3, 2, and 1. So welcome everyone to a very, very special session. We decided to do this session an hour earlier today to accommodate Kitt, who is joining us from Australia, and also for some of our Australian guests and his colleagues who are joining us this evening. Welcome to the live session of Working in UX Design. This is a podcast and this is a monthly event where we have a live audience where we interview speakers and practitioners from the field of user experience design, and they are actually working in Asia Pacific, and that's our focus, and we want to give them a voice to talk about their experiences working in the product design, user experience design discipline. And this is such a huge discipline where we've interviewed people talking about content design, about UX design, and today we're going to speak about design for inclusivity, especially from the perspective of someone who identifies himself as queer and working in the tech sector. Sometimes someone like Kitt, who's actually an Asian diaspora, who's working overseas in a Western economy like Australia, working for one of the most successful tech startups over there, Xero, which we are a personal user as well, and we use it for our business and we use it to run our account and finance in our business. So just a short introduction of Kitt, and I've personally known Kitt for several years, and Kitt is someone who shares vast experience as an experienced designer and freelance illustrator and design mentor. We first met at Creative Morning Singapore, which was a event I was organizing, and Kitt was one of our volunteers, as well as someone who contributed his time and his passion into the creative discipline by helping us with the designs when we didn't have a designer. Now, he's currently based in Canberra, Australia, and has more than 12 years of experience in the industry, working along with agencies and getting involved in different aspects, working with teams and collaborating with clients to articulate their philosophy and business requirements into unique design languages in the digital space. And Kitt is also an avid visual artist in his free time, and he takes a keen interest in convergence of design and technology and how it creates meaningful digital experiences. So let's welcome Kitt, and Kitt, please fill in any information that I might have missed out.
Thanks, Dylan. Happy to be here. Yeah, well, before I answer that, I would just like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm meeting you today, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I also extend this respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who might be in attendance today. Yeah, so I guess a little bit about me. And to add into that, I don't know if everyone else who shares this, but I come from a different design discipline. So I finished architecture at university, and after that, I think I got a little bit jaded and I moved to web design and front-end development. And that's, I guess, where my journey in design started. And ever since, I've been working in design agencies and consultancy and freelancing before I move on to product, which is now, I work at Xero now as senior product designer. So yeah.
Excellent. And thanks for sharing, Kitt. I think you've worked in both Singapore and now you're working in Australia, and you've worked in agencies in Singapore and then like in a product setting. So let's start with the difference, right? In terms of working in an agency versus working in product. What are some of the differences you've identified as a UX or product designer?
Yeah, this is an age-old question that a few of my mentors and students always ask me, and I guess being in an agency kind of context for so many years, one of the things that I mostly kind of recognize is it is a very cutthroat industry. And, I think I found myself when I was in Singapore, mostly like having sleepless nights, trying to kind of ship, a project which just runs for like, I don't know, 3-6 months or something, right? And that's kind of the whole life cycle of a typical kind of project that you have in an agency context. I think the longest one that we have was around 6 to 8, 12 months probably, but it's mostly bursts of like short projects, which, leaves you kind of working too hard and really pushing yourselves. But I guess what it did, in terms of honing my craft, like it pushed me to, I guess, push the boundaries in terms of, what kind of design can I offer and can I do, right? And as soon as I built that foundation, I guess moving into product was really a massive culture shock for me. I remember my first week in Xero, I asked one of my design team, hey, it's been a week since I started. Do we have a timesheet? Because usually in agency, right, in consultancy, that's how you're billed, by your time, right? It's always to man hours and a man time. And everyone basically just laughed at me. Oh, we don't work by timesheets. We're pretty much work through, I guess, get measured by the quality and the impact of our work. And oh, that's great. And then I guess from there, it just started a series of culture shock where it was really challenging and interesting for me to move to a little bit of a slower pace where I had to understand domain knowledge, which you don't get, I guess, in an agency because, in terms of knowledge that you have with a client, right, it's very fleeting. You get 3 months project, you learn about something. Oh, I learned about that. And then it's gone.
Sorry, Kit, we lost you for a bit on, I think it auto mutes for some reason. Yeah. Yeah, so you said you stopped at 3 months and then?
Yeah, so you get fleeting information, for 3 months with the knowledge or the domain that you're working with a client, right, in an agency. After that, it's gone. It becomes really great for cocktail conversations, but it's that cycle where you learn something and then you lose something in the end. But what it leaves me is that foundation of design skills that I get to use now in product design.
Excellent. And what's your preference? Like, do you prefer working in an agency? Do you prefer working in this kind of a product design culture that you describe?
Gosh, this is because now my colleagues are here, but I think right now I don't know if I have a preference though. I think I'm really grateful that where I work right now, we definitely, I guess champion, well-being. And that's basically what attracted me to Xero in the first place. I think the first time I got a call, I think that was the main selling point that, that was, I guess, sold to me. And I'm like, oh, great. Because I was in the middle of running this enterprise project. And I'm like, oh, I've had it. I need to move somewhere else. And I was like, oh, and then, it was really fascinating to be able to actually do your work on a daily basis, but at the same time, have some time for yourself. So now I think I enjoy that more than ever. But I'm not closing my doors in agency, definitely. I think there's definitely some gold things that you can pick up from, working in a very fast paced environment. So.
Yeah. And thank you for sharing that. And I think it's been such a great experience for you to work in 2 different countries and 2 different cultures. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how the design culture is like working in Xero, because you mentioned that it's a little bit more chill, it's a little bit more impact driven. So maybe describe a little bit more about how you would describe the design culture at Xero itself.
Yeah, I'm just going to slip in, whenever, the topic that we're going to be talking about, diversity and inclusion. I think if I want to describe the design culture at Xero is that it is a place where you don't feel othered. And I think it's really important to be able to identify that because we're a strong team of hundreds of designers that come from different places and background. And one of the things that the first thing that I remember the first time I attended a design crit. Usually in an agency, right, happens design crit every week. It's very, I guess it's very competitive, and the first time I attended our design crit at Xero, it was almost a welcoming thing where I presented something and everyone's just like innately curious. And I felt like I wasn't being judged for something that I just did the first time when I started working there. So I think that culture that embraces your ideas, that reflects your values is, I think, something that I can describe, our design team.
That's excellent. What do you think is, I'm guessing you have colleagues who work internationally as well, like, and as you're hearing that, what do you think is quite distinct about working for one of the largest Australian tech startups, right, versus like working in Silicon Valley or maybe working in London? Like is there any observations or difference you've identified or anyone commented, or is there no difference at all?
Yeah, I have friends who work in those places, and look, it really is dependent on what you as a person or as a design practitioner want to get out of working in those areas, right? When you think of Silicon Valley, oh, it's same thing. It's very cutthroat. The pay is really good. I know Jay talked about that before. It was just really interesting. But when I decided to go into Xero, it was really all about that that diversity that they have. When I started researching, what Xero was, I found out that our executive general manager in design was a woman, and that was really fascinating for me because it's, you hear about stories in organization which driven by men all the time, white men, and it was such quite an eye-opener. It's like, oh, yeah, they have their design leader people is a woman, great. And then when I first got interviewed, it was a mix of different people from different backgrounds. And so I guess what I'm saying there is, whatever your priorities are, I don't know if that, I guess, matters whichever you want to work. But during that time when I accepted, the offer in working in Xero, I think the values that I had back then reflected, what the company was aiming for in their values. So to me, I think that was the main decision and main difference that I could probably took away with. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's excellent. And thank you so much for sharing about how different Xero is. And I was just wondering, you joined at a time where it was just before the pandemic, and I was just out of curiosity, like, has anything changed? Because I understand Australia went through multiple seasons and sessions of flash lockdowns, and that just means like people couldn't go out and couldn't go into the office. So how did that transform the way your team has been working? Yeah.
Yeah. The crazy times went through over the past 2 years, right? Actually, when the pandemic started, the lockdown started, I was in my previous agency, and so I was in the middle of moving to Xero when when everything just became an avalanche of lockdowns, right? And I thought, well, great, I'm not going to be in the office, I'm not going to meet anyone. I need to be extra alert and hyper vigilant in terms of really being self-aware and how I sort of present myself to the team, right? Because I was being onboarded remotely. And it's always a challenge when you're looking forward to meet people, to actually build relationships with them in the first day, because you want to feel like you belong, right? But surprisingly, it turns out it was one of the best onboarding I have ever experienced, where I got my, they usually send you a merch kit, and that's the first thing that I got. And I was in the middle of a client workshopped that time at previous agency. So I received it. And then the next thing I know, my machine comes in. And then, a few days later, I was being onboarded. And it was just a smooth onboarding for me that I didn't have to actually worry about the other extra stuff, which is, doing admin stuff like logging in and things like everything was all set up. So yeah, I think I was very lucky on that.
Well, that's thanks for sharing your onboarding process. And how was it like in maybe the last year or two working remotely from your home office? Is this like your home office that's in your background right now?
It's a small part where you can see the kitchen in the back.
Yeah.
I think there are certainly some challenges around, definitely managing your time in terms of, when do you actually finish? Because sometimes work bleeds into your personal time or family time. But I always see to it that at a certain point, I stop and, my partner comes in and we have dinner and watch a movie together. But one of the things that we champion at Xero is having really a focused time or a personal time. So you can, really do great work that that's meaningful to you. And specifically in our team, so we have something called Flow Time, which happens every week. So from 3 p.m. on Wednesday up to, end of business, you can, pretty much do some extra reading if you want to. And it just makes a whole lot difference from the whole week that you're kind of, pushing pixels or talking to people. And, talking to people is exhausting, right? And that's what a lot of, designers do. On the contrary, people think that, we just go on Figma and just design stuff. Actually, almost 80% of our job is like talking to people, persuading people and convincing people. So
Thanks for sharing some of the practices that you had. I think that's really interesting because this spirit of continuous learning is also pretty much what defines the working culture in startups. So I understand you're working in the tech industry as someone who identifies himself as a queer person. So I was just wondering, what are some of the challenges, or are there any challenges working in the tech industry, being a queer person as well? I for one know that Singapore is pretty strict about that label. So yeah, what are some of your general experiences? Yeah.
Oh boy, do I have some stories for you. So why does, when you hit me up around, what do I kind of care about in terms of, or champion about in terms of design? And when I replied about, diversity and inclusion, I was really interested because one, it hits home to me because I've experienced inequities firsthand as an Asian person and also as a queer person. And I think it is very timely to talk about now as well, because, with the past few years that we experienced, experienced social reckoning around racial justice with the Black Lives Matter movement, Stop Asian Hate, right? Companies have started taking this seriously, and, we will continue to see taking this seriously, building a more diverse and inclusive workplace. And I think as a minority, we're in a place where we can help amplify and give voice to this cause and movement. And talking about my experience, I'd have to go back when I was a kid, when I started to, kind of try to discover myself and start to, identifying myself as a queer person. And, throughout those times, people, in the Philippines, for example, you get easily called out in that. And I built resilience and muscle in terms of reflecting those. But as soon as I started working, so surprisingly, like when I moved to Singapore, it wasn't my queerness that wasn't calling out, especially in a corporate environment. It was mostly my part of my identity, which is being a Filipino. And this is going to be a trigger warning for anyone who's a minority listening to this conversation. One of the every day on a regular basis, I would experience certain, indignities and inequities through microaggressions, for example, But one of the things I would never forget is I was in a client, we're having a meeting, and one of the project managers, were trying to introduce us and like, oh, this person, and she's from, I guess, she's from the UK, and then this person, he's from Singapore, and then he turns to me and unwittingly says, oh, him, never mind him. And immediately I was taken aback. I basically froze. And so, oh God, I don't know what that was, but I'm just going to continue this meeting. And it took me a while to absorb that. I think, I don't know, for a few months, I think, or even a year. It was a time when I was about to leave Singapore that I opened it up to one of my creative directors, and he was fuming. It's like, you should have told me this a while ago. And this is the thing with inequities, right? It becomes a problem when you start internalizing it, because when those internalizations that you may have may come in the form of passive aggressiveness, or it erodes your self-confidence, for example. And the thing with self-confidence, which is really important as design practitioners, right, as part of our job, we stand up in a workshop full of people, we speak up, right? And you really need to have some sort of, at least some form of self-confidence in that. And when someone does all of these microaggressions to you, it impacts how you present yourself and how you manage risk and self-disclosure, and creativity. Expressing your creativities and ideas is part of self-disclosure. And so think about that, right? And that's why I feel really strongly that at some point I wanted to understand what are my barriers are, and what kind of roadmap should I build to identify those, and how to sort of help me address that. And it's hard, right? Especially in an Asian culture where we're not used to confrontation, for example. We're just so respectful of people with the hierarchy, and we don't speak up. So yeah, it's one of the, I guess, the most one of the stories that I don't think I'd ever forget.
Well, it's very, very unfortunate that you had to go through, and I'm sure many people go through this as well in their work life, but they don't actually talk about it. So thank you for sharing that story. And I was just wondering, when you face these microaggressions, when you face passive aggressiveness, or all these indignities as you described them, do you feel like you have to change your behavior to fit in, right? Just because this is happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the things that happens as well, is that you sort of try to shift your mentality and try to position yourself so that you avoid these kind of interactions. If the thing is, like, I find myself on either side of defenses, where when I'm being, I guess, when I'm being called out from Asianness, for example, and then I started interacting with people, there are two things that usually happen. One, when I started talking, people would always, this is a form of microaggression as well, when people always insist that, hey, did you study abroad, or things like that. Sure enough, sure, fair enough. Like, that's probably a legit question, but most of the time it's the context. Oh, your English is great. It's like, okay. The second one is, if I try to speak out, people would explain things to me many times as if, like, I don't know what they're talking about. And so it's just like managing this, even though how many times I try to shift and position my mentality, I always come with the other side where it's like, I'm never going to win this thing, because it's such a double whammy to be an Asian, a queer person. So it's like, you can't escape it. But look, some of the things that happen, to me, it's not all inequities. And there are some areas, for example, in Singapore, for example, where my queerness was celebrated. When I started going to the art scene and started doing exhibitions and art, I was celebrated for my my difference, and I was embraced by that. And this is the thing that I always tell my students, my design students. it takes courage to, put yourself out there, no matter your race or gender, but you have to do it because that opens doors for you. It takes a while, but you'll reap the benefits later on, and you can start expressing yourself, and build more muscle to actually approach these kind of interaction.
It certainly takes a lot of courage to step out and to be vulnerable in some of these situations. What was the most unpleasant experience? I mean, I'm not sure if you actually want to revisit that, but what has been the most unpleasant experience in terms of racism, for you being Asian or a minority from the Philippines, or being a queer person?
Yeah, I think so far, I'm grateful that that was it, basically. I don't know if and I don't wish I would, that would happen again. But yeah, it was that, I think that was the most, I guess, horrible, if, for lack of a better word, this happened. Yeah, I don't think I remember. I think other than that, it was just, the usual microaggressions that you experience at a workplace, which sometimes people think they could pass up as a joke or something. So.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for sharing. And I think that's really, microaggressions or passive aggressiveness is really a start or a small kind of like tiptoeing into the area of like disrespecting someone, right? So I don't think it's cool at all. How has it been like working as an Asian diaspora in Australia, right? You're working in a Western economy, or more westernized society, right? How has that experience been for you?
Yeah, well, look, it was really fascinating. And I think I also had a little bit of culture shock when I moved here. But the whole idea, of moving here was really to, was looking for a place where my partner and I could be sort of, legally recognized. And it was such a beautiful moment when a year later, when we moved here, Australia voted in favor of legalizing, same-sex marriage. And it was really very, very timely. But then I remember that when I first got here, coming from Philippines and Singapore, which is a very, very busy city, country, it took me a while to actually get acclimatized to the quietness that is Canberra. So I remember the first time when I landed here, it's like, where's the mall? Oh, the mall's closed at 4 p.m. And I'm like, what? Are you kidding me? Mall's closed at 12 a.m. or like 1 a.m. Like, that doesn't happen. And then as soon as, it hit me, oh gosh, I'm never gonna be in a mall anymore after work because it closes early. But yeah, there's definitely a massive contrast in terms of like culture, for example. Um, I think one of the things that, in America, for example, people are, always down for, they're always gung-ho about individualism and things like that. I don't know if I necessarily noticed that with the culture here. I think if anything, people are very down to earth, which, made I guess, my change of scenery and pace and getting, immersed in the culture quite a little bit easier. There's no verbal sparing, like, what I guess Americans always like to do. And there's always like this big conversations about things, but it's clearly quite the opposite here. And so, which I appreciate. There are some, things in here which still gets to me. Like, I guess when Australians always say like, hey, there's no, no dramas or anything, which they only mean to say, hey, no worries. It still gets to me because it's like, no dramas. I'm not making drama. And it's just so interesting. But yeah, other than that, it was very easy from a nation context moving here. Yeah, it didn't take me a long time to actually kind of just blend in or or even be myself. Yeah.
And that's great, really great to hear. Especially earlier in our conversation, you sort of wanted to acknowledge the indigenous people as well. So I was just wondering, um, what prompted you to do that, or is there anything you like to expand on that?
Yeah, for sure. So one of the things that we do in Australia, especially when there is a significant event, like this, for example, whether it's a remote, especially now that we're on remote, is recognizing, the people who have come before us, especially here in Australia, which is the traditional owners of the land, which is the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and it's that is called the acknowledgement of country, and that's different in every place where you are. So, for example, in Sydney, it would be the Gadigal and the Eora Nation as the traditional custodians, or in Melbourne, you have the Boonwurrung, Boon Wurrung, and Wurundjeri Moi Wurrung peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation. So wherever you are, and when you're presenting or in a team, it's a custom to pay respects to them, to the traditional owners. So
And that's such a simple practice to be inclusive. And
definitely.
yeah, I was just wondering, as an Asian diaspora, as a queer person, would you see any sort of practices that startups or companies can introduce to be more accommodating to minorities, right? Like yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that I actually wanted to kind of talk about is, how important it is right now to kind of tackle diversity and inclusion. And in Xero, we actually call it inclusion, diversity, and belonging. But for everyone who's, interested in this topic, I think I would like to start around really what do we mean by diversity and inclusion, right? And when I was doing my research, I come across this definition. It was just beautifully written around diversity, which is it's a full spectrum of human differences. And so age, race, gender, physical abilities, neurodiversions, or diversity in experience, right? And inclusion is just means ensuring that every employee or every human in your organization feels included and part of the team. So a lot of the companies think about that right now, diversity and inclusion, and they score it, or they measure it using diversity metrics, business cases, scorecards, and targets, right? But inclusion is a little nebulous, it's a little hazy to measure, right? There are some indicators, for example, your attrition, your happiness level as an employee, but diversity without inclusion is, will not amount to really any significant change, right? It just becomes a numbers game. And that's, if you just have diversity, for example, it's just another, of, I guess, diversity project. You're hiring someone of a different kind of background, and it's definitely lazy, and it's quite short gain, right? But there is this notion that Francis Fry, who's an educator at Harvard, around, what you said around the order of diversity and inclusion, which I'm happy that, in Xero we're actually doing. She said, a lot of people think about diversity and inclusion and it's in the wrong sequence. She said that bringing a lot of diversity or diverse talent doesn't actually follow inclusion. Right. And I think hard about that, because it is true. When inclusion comes first, right, diversity follows. So when you embrace everyone and make them feel safe, all of these, all of these things that you find for diversity, that automatically follows, especially if you put inclusion first as, part of your, I guess, part of your program or platform organization. So there are definitely some things. Why would, a business, what can we do to actually make, make the workplace a better, a safer place for minority or for everyone really, because we know from a lot of research that it benefits the leaders in an organization, right? It creates an environment that supports equality, equal pay. It fosters collaboration, better collaboration and communication, but also, organizations are 6 times more likely to innovate. And if you're in a tech industry, that's a very important number to think about. So, case in point, like Nike, who also has a, very diverse and inclusive organization. And I'm simplifying this based on immediate stats that they have around their directors. Half of them are women, for example. And look what they just introduced, right? Was it last year or a few months ago, the hands-free shoe, to go fly east. And even MasterCard, right, who just released, accessible credit cards or debit cards for visually impaired people or people who are blind. So think about that and the benefits of taking care of your people and making an inclusive workspace, right? It benefits your, a lot of things, especially business profit. And I always go back to one of these beautiful quotes from MasterCard's Chief Marketing Communications, Raja Manar. He says, innovation should be driven by the impulse to include. And isn't that such a beautiful thing to actually kind of, to promote, right?
Can
When
you
we
repeat that statement again, so we catch it?
So Raja Manar says, the Chief Marketing Communications Officer of MasterCard, innovation should always be driven by the impulse to include.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So apt.
I don't know if I can re-explain that further, but it's such a beautiful reminder of, of how diverse we are internally as an organization and the way it reflects, people that we design for, right? So, yeah.
I think that's a great segue to a topic. I mean, Xero is a global product, right? You do not only design for the Australian market, you design for the world. What are some of the things that you have to be mindful of, or what is different in the design process when you're designing for the world versus for just like a local market, which you did when you were working for an agency?
So one of the things that we do in Xero definitely is being able to have that self-awareness and cognizant that we're designing for everyone, right? And that everyone reflects organization as well. And so I am part of a design team where we actually concentrate in Australia. And I can tell you that there are definitely some considerations that we've kind of talked about before we start making design decisions. And the good thing about having a diverse, organization is that, and having a diverse kind of global team and being able to kind of address that on a global scale is that you can tap on every one of your team to actually get, cultural context, for example. So, it gives you that ability to, I guess, connect with with other designers to be able to understand what is the context of the problem that you're solving for in that particular area. Because look, if for example, my remit would be customers in the UK, I would have to understand, and I'm here in Australia, I would need to have a lot of context, social, cultural, to be able to understand and make design decisions, before I even ship it, right? Otherwise, it'll get lost. People won't understand it. So these are the kind of things and the nuances that you'd have to think about, especially when you're designing on or solving problems on a global scale.
Yeah, that's something good to be mindful about. Would in terms of the research process, because you talk about getting context and all that, how do you attempt to gather context then? Like, especially when you're in lockdown, you have to work remotely. What are some of the practices you have in your design team that enables you to gather context?
Yeah, that's a very good question because our customers, mix of well, small. We design for small business, right? And definitely with what happened, to us 2 years ago and started pandemic, right? It's been really difficult for everyone to actually be able to make yourself available. And so we had to be mindful of when we try to recruit, for example. And one of the differences that I've actually noticed, working in an agency and then Xero when we do research, is that in an agency, we have this. You can definitely like do like super quick testing, and moderate it, but you can get like quick results, for example. However, the way I guess we approach things, because I've actually recently just done a research, um, in the form of, I guess, qualitative work. And I think that helps us understand the context of our users or participants better, because we understand the space that they're in. We get to be mindful of we're recruiting the context that they have currently. So for example, if I'm interviewing someone who's based in Melbourne and they're in lockdown, then at least I have an indication of how I might approach it. And that's just being sensitive, right, to that participant's need. So we're mindful of that nuances that people are impacted by, whether it's the pandemic or something else.
So what I'm hearing you say is that in terms of recruiting, you're a little bit more sensitive by even like the way you message and recruit participants or invite participants based on that scenario. But also, I guess as a follow-up question as well, like, do you feel you're able to get as much context as you need to conducting some of these types of research online? Because usually I think the privilege of working offline and being able to travel is the ability to immerse yourself as a designer and just kind of like soak in everything. So yeah, how do you kind of manage what the missing pieces from that kind of like inquiry or research?
Yeah, that's another great question, because in my previous agency, I was actually doing guerrilla research and in context research. I was going to places, and I was going to places where I was talking to people in a context of their physical space that they're in. And I can tell you how exciting that was, but also very tiring, holding a MacBook, a machine on your left hand, and like holding a recorder and just like, talking to them. And, they were kind of doing their own thing. We're following them around. It felt like I was a documentary, filmmaker. And I was like, great, I want to experience this again. But then at the end of the day, it was a 3-day marathon of interviewing people. And like, I was so tired. The good thing about it is that we get to see them and record them, the way they would kind of do things. Obviously, to try to, ignore us, that we're there only when they ask, when we ask them questions. And there's definitely, I guess, that's the one thing that you can do with remote interviews, for example. You don't have an idea where the space they're at. So for example, say you want to test a form, and that form is actually based on a physical form, like a paper form. You won't have any idea how they kind of, shift or switch code between paper and then online. And so you really have to be very cognizant how you ask your questions. What are you doing there? Why are you doing that? And so it kind of builds your research muscle in terms of asking tricky or more interesting questions to bring out that context, and that's going to be a forever challenge for us now that, the workplace has gone from, mixed, physical space and online, right?
Yeah, that certainly is a challenge, and I think it's also up to our creativity as UX practitioners to bring in the necessary data to support that context, or even decide on the appropriate research methods, such as like maybe using diary studies, for example, to bring in those contexts. Yeah, so Kitt, I want to spend maybe the last part of this interview a little bit more on your teaching and your mentoring experience. I understand that you mentor and teach for various organizations, and you mentioned something about you working with students and people in the industry. Maybe let's start with what you've sort of identified as some of the skills gap, or what you notice in terms of talent, especially in the product design or UX design field in Australia. Let's start with that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's zoom out a bit and look at, Australia in terms of, I guess, skills, and I guess the skills gaps in there. So I think there was a report published last year by Swinburne University, and also this year by RMIT University, around, the Australian skills gap, right? And RMIT mentions about the digital skills. And in that, they mentioned that, digital jobs are going to be, are particularly going to be the focus of 80% of jobs in Australia. And I was like, what does that mean, right? And you think about it, because, from a tech, working as a, in a tech industry, right? This doesn't kind of ring a bell to me, because I'm in the tech industry and I have digital skills. And then I started thinking, well, could it be, what if it would flip it around, and what if you're in an agency, or what if I'm actually working with clients or stakeholders who have to operate online now, right? And it couldn't be more far from what they've just describing, in that, you see, before the pandemic, for example, I was already running remote workshops with our clients in Sydney, and you can see like that online collaboration was very much a pretty new thing, to most of the people. And we had to think of ways to kind of go around using Miro, for example, drawing on actual paper and then posting it in Miro. And it was a very challenging but really quite fun moment. And this is what, it was referring to, right? How do we sort of, I guess, help, clients or people or stakeholders kind of operate online? The other thing in that is, Swinmer mentioned around that specialist technical skills, for example, and that's basically us design practitioners in the tech, right? And that's always going to be, on a growth trajectory. But what was interesting for me was human skills. And really, this is about this. They said this is going to be, one of the most in-demand skills that you'll ever have. And I totally agree with that, because that human skills include, empathy, developing rapport, storytelling, creative inquiry. And that's the thing that I sort of noticed with, when I started teaching students and mentoring students. One, they always forget, they have this idea that, design, they romanticize it, and they would romanticize it. Not, I'm generalizing here, but it's a very glamorous job. And the first time I meet a student, I would just lay it out, in basic terms. Look, it's just like any other job. You had a job before, you were an architect or a lawyer before, it's the same thing, right? You're going to go to work 9 to 5, maybe more than that. So, I mean, are you up for it? Because I don't, I basically, it's really hard to know, but that's the thing, right? You have to realize that it takes more than actually designing. Part of the job that we have is using those soft skills or those human skills to actually communicate, the things that we want to solve for. And this is where, what I was talking about, that how diversity impacts that. When you start internalizing all of these inequities, it impacts your human skills. So I always tell them, look, no matter regardless of your background, you have a point of view. You have a unique lens that you can look, you can use to look into solving problems. So create your story and own your narrative, and practice storytelling and practice empathy, creative inquiry, and all these things, because that's the tool that you're going to be using along with your technical design skills.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing that. And this is probably one of the most underappreciated areas that I don't think a lot of traditional education institutions place a focus on, which is like how can designers collaborate better together? How can they better communicate or tell the story, or even sell the design to a stakeholder, or how can they involve them in that collaborative process, especially when working remotely? All these things are challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. I can tell you one particular student who came to me to ask for a portfolio review. The portfolio was freaking amazing. This person worked in one of biggest tech companies, from Google to Uber to Facebook. And I kid you not, the portfolio was 150 pages. And I'm like, I'm not going to read this whole 150 pages. So we sat down, look, what is the goal that you want to have in terms of storytelling and impact? So storytelling is equally as important as also as editing. So when you know how to tell a story, you know which one to cut and which ones you think you can use to make that impact that you want, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think the art of being concise is a underappreciated skill.
Artistically terse, yes.
And I was just wondering, you've mentored a lot of students, you've seen a lot of portfolios, and probably you participated in some of the hiring decisions at Xero as well. As you're looking at portfolios, what would be your advice to a junior designer or to a mid-career person trying to transition into this industry? What are the common mistakes you're seeing in these portfolios?
So yeah, like I mentioned, it's that particular voice that you have. I always ask them, and also, personality as well. It's not always, your technical design skills. It's all about you as well. What can you add in the table as an addition to our team, for example? And I can tell you, have so many people who have come from different backgrounds. I remember one person asked us on one of our Slack channels, what job did you used to have before you became a designer? And one was a classical pianist. And I was like, oh, that must have a really amazing discipline, doing design every day. And then there was one who really struck me, he used to be a truck driver in South Africa, and he used to teach other people how to drive trucks. And so, people who come from unfortunate, backgrounds, right, and it basically started his interest in UX design. And to me, that's one of the fascinating stories in which, I look at a lens in terms of hiring. It's, sometimes people think, oh, you have to be able to do this, technical stuff. Yes, correct. But it's also more than that. If I'm talking to students who are applying for a job, I always tell them, look, you got this, but you got to understand the organization that you're applying for. What are the values that they have? Do they reflect your own values? And which values actually resonates more with you? Because ultimately, you want to be working with an organization where you feel you can, you feel you're I guess, communicate your authentic self, right? And so as an interviewer, I have to think about tricky question to kind of surface these, nuances with the people that we interview, because it's not always about your technical skills.
Yeah, that's such an important point. Is there a good way for someone who is maybe a little bit lost or maybe a little bit confused to find his or her voice?
Yeah, look, one of the things that I send my students as a, on the first day as a package is this video of kinetic video, and it's called The Gap. So The Gap is actually, it was based on an article, I think written, or maybe by Ira Glass, which is the host of NPR, This American Life, sorry. And so
Is it by Ira Glass?
Ira Glass,
Yeah.
yes,
Okay.
IRA. So The Gap basically talks about, so you start in design, right? You start thinking about that because you have a taste. That taste is that little voice that you have that you use, to be able to, for you to use as a springboard in terms of how you want to develop your design, right? It's small, but soon as you get more experience, and not just design, it's connecting ideas together, right? People always think that, oh, I'm going to be designing, and it's, when I ask people, well, what do you do, after work or weekends, right? Oh, I just sit around and things like that. And I'm like, so you're just basically a designer, like, Monday to Friday. I mean, no one answers that, but where I'm getting at is, there are parts of creativity that you can use and tap into to connect together and piece this together, right? It takes a while to make these connections, but you have that already. You have a taste, you know what good design is, and that's a good start for you. The only thing that you need to do is find those dots, expose yourself to, not just design, to films and books and, other art, and it'll help you open other areas that you probably wouldn't have tapped into on a regular basis. And that's what basically is creativity is about, and you use in your everyday design problem solving.
I think it's great because earlier when I was introducing you, I recall that you also you are someone who's passionate about illustration. Would you like to tell us a little bit more, like how this interest or this hobby or this side hustle has sort of like maybe help you secure your jobs, or help you define yourself as a creative?
Yeah. So I was really grateful when, when I was in Singapore, that the art scene embraced me. And, I was doing exhibitions with individually and with a group of people. And I found myself getting interviewed. And do not Google that interview. But and what that helped me basically is being able to, art is a very personal thing, right? It's, when you interview people to talk about it, it's either going to be highfalutin or, and because it comes from a personal place, right? So what it taught me is to actually use my, when you pitch, my pitching skills for design, to actually explain what art, the kind of art I'm doing, or the kind of exhibition that I was, participating in. So that basically, I guess, honing those things together basically kind of helped me hone not just design and art, but creativity alone. And I think having interest in other things help you a lot in terms of honing your creativity.
Yeah, I was just reminded as I was trying to Google the interview that we had this brief stint where you and I, we were volunteering at Creative Mornings together with Kiara, who used to be the editor of Grid magazine in the Philippines. And I just noticed that you also are a journalist or was a journalist, interviewing people. Yeah, like, well, you want to talk a little bit about that and how that sort of like played to the whole mix of who you are as a creative?
This is crazy. But yeah, I was very I think that's one of the highlight of like working with Kiara on that, on Grid magazine, was being able to be in that same page and actually understanding and getting to know Alexandra Cousteau. For anyone who isn't aware of her, she's an explorer who whose father is, I forgot what her name, her father was, but who's a very well-renowned French, sea explorer. And so I think, yeah, that was a very, very interesting
Did
kind
you
of
also
project.
post illustrations because they look really beautiful?
Yeah, I did. And a year later, she actually Jax Cousteau, thanks, LA. And so a year later, she posted on Instagram, and I was just, I was just in cloud nine. I wasn't expecting it, but I think this is where, like I said, having variety of interests, whether it's art or other things, really help you you know understand your true potential and explore other avenues in terms of culminating that creativity and design.
Yeah, that's excellent. I'm so glad you brought that up, and I'm so glad I Googled you because yeah, if you want to see Kitt's work, we're attaching it to the YouTube video. We're gonna put it in the link. It's with Grid magazine. You can see his illustration, you can see his writing, so that's really good. And the video he recommended earlier, which is The Gap by Ara Glass, that was also something I saw when I was a design student, and I'm very it really hit home because I knew at that point in time, yeah, I was not good enough, right? And then I was like, oh yeah, well, what else can I do? And I really want to bring everything back into this topic of diversity and inclusion. You taken us on a journey almost on, how diverse is your workplace and how your workplace celebrates diversity and inclusion in very small ways. I mean, even the simple act of asking, what were you doing before you became a designer? I think that is a very simple act of inclusion.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So yeah, I was just wondering if you have any final thoughts on the overall theme and topic that we have today, or even like final advice that you would like to give other design leaders or design students. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. If I'm going to summarize it, think about diversity and inclusion and what it means in your organization, and find ways to actually amplify that voice for not just for yourself as a minority, if you identify as minority or not, but for your other team as well, because it is a responsibility as humans to make the environment that we work in a safe place for other people, so we can flourish as an organization. Because when we flourish as humans in a team or in an organizational environment, you know things get better. And like I said, we are open to being vulnerable, we're open to change and innovation, so it's definitely a win-win for everyone.
And excellent advice. With that note, we'll end the live session. Thank you, Kitt, for joining us from Australia and staying up late for this. Really appreciate it. And thank you everyone who's sort of posed their questions and also kind of contributed to this interview itself. We will be having the podcast release in a couple of months' time. And if you want to check out the recording of this interview, you can check out our YouTube page, CuriousCore. And we are a school based in Singapore that's helping mid-career professionals to make the transition into UX design. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending. We will now go into the sort of like networking session.